How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Beis, Daf 32 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, Daf Lamed Beis is mamish a gewalt. It is not a difficult daf. It is a very interesting daf. There's a lot of interesting halachas about writing Sifrei Torah, about writing mezuzahs, about writing Tefillin. So let us jump in. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of interesting sugyas, a lot of interesting things to talk about on today's daf. So there are 6 sections, which usually means it might be a big one, but I'm not sure about that this time, but I'm never sure about anything. Okay, number 1, fixing tears in a sefer Torah. If a sefer Torah gets torn, can you fix it? Can't you fix it? That's topic discussion number 1. Number 2, the column of a mezuzah, right? Essentially how to write a mezuzah, right? How the text is written in a mezuzah. That is going to be an interesting discussion. The spacing of a mezuzah between parashiyot. Now that's going to be a real fascinating discussion and some real interesting questions there. The parchment of Sifrei kodesh. What are Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, mezuzahs? What are they written on? What are they written on? What should they be written on? Ideally. Interesting questions there. Etching the lines in a Sifrei kodesh, what's called sirtut, right? If you ever looked in Sifrei kodesh, a sefer Torah, although the question is which Sifrei kodesh? Certainly Mezuzahs at least. Megillas Esther, there's lines on it. There's sirtut, etches that the sefer follows those lines when writing. And finally, sitting on the same couch as a sefer Torah. Can you do it? Can't you do it? Friends, this is what we have ahead of us. This is what we have to enjoy for the next little while together. Friends, let's jump in and study Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Menachos together. Friends, we begin on Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis, second line of the Daf. Second line of the Amid, Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. Amr Reb Zeira, says Reb Zeira, Amr Reb Chananel, Amr Rab, Kera haba b'shnei shitin Yispor b'shalosh al Yispor. If there is a tear in the Sefer Torah, a tear coming from the bottom of the Sefer Torah, gets torn from the bottom or from the top, and it goes into the column where there is text. So if it goes 2 columns in, you can sew it up. 3 columns in, you can't sew it up. So now this assumes that it is not breaking or tearing any of the letters. If the letters break, then that is a problem. But this is, I don't know, somehow tearing into the lines, into 2 lines, into up to 2 lines, and including 2 lines, so long as it is not tearing any of the letters. You can sew it back together. When we say that if the tear is 3 lines in, it can't be sewn up. That is by an old Torah scroll. But if it is a new Torah scroll, then it can even be torn, can be sewed up if it is 3. The tear is 3 lines in. Now, how do we define old and new? It is not like it sounds. When we say old, we don't literally mean like 100 years old. Rather, it means, has the cloth been treated with gallnut juice? If it has been treated with gallnut juice, well, then it will have a darker shade. And if it has a darker shade, then the tear is more pronounced. If the tear is more pronounced, well, then you can only fix it if it's up to 2 lines in. If it does not have gallnut juice and it is lighter, well, then it can even tolerate a larger tear. When we're talking about fixing up, when we're talking about sewing the Sefer Torah together, we are talking about using sinew threads. The thread, all of the parts involved in the Sefer Torah are animal hide, sinews for threads. Aval begrorin low, but not with like threads, not with like fabric threads or whatever. It has to be made out of sinews, animal sinews. By Reb Yehuda bar Abba, Ravid Bar Abba asks, "Bein daf ladaf ben shita l'shita my teku." What about between the columns if there is a tear that doesn't go into the lines? What about? I think what this means is if like in between, like if the tear originates, I think in between the lines, we say it is a tie. All right. Well, that was section 1 of Daf Lamed Beis, technically Lamed Aleph. So as I said, there's 6 sections to today's Daf, but they're not particularly difficult and they are interesting in my opinion. Amr B'Zeiri, Amr B'Chananel, Amr Rab Mezuzah. When it comes to writing a mezuzah, shekozva shtaim kshera. If you write 2 words per line, two words per row, kshera. What if you write 2 words on this line, 3 words on the next, 1 word on the line after that? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kol shekin shasa kshira. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, of course it's good. You made it like a poem, poetry. Who doesn't like poetry? Mezuzah, however, we have a question. Asa ki shira o shira kimosa psula. If you make it like a poem or a poem like it is psula. A lot of its. Kitanya hi sefer Torah. Yeah, but that's talking about a sefer Torah. If I understand correctly, what it means is that, of course, in the sefer Torah there is the shira, right? Shira Sayam, Az Yashir that we read a few weeks ago. Now, Shira Sayam, of course, is written in case anybody hasn't seen it for themselves. I actually don't have a photo of it. Maybe I could have gotten a photo, but I don't. It is written in kind of a poetic style. There is, right, you'll have one line that has words, space, words. The next line has space, words, space, words, space, words, space, words, space, right? And they alternate like that. So that's the Shira. So if you write other sections of the Sefer Torah like you write the Shira, it's possible. If you write the Shira like the other sections of the Sefer Torah and just regular columns, it is also possible. However, when it comes to a mezuzah, you can write it in poetic form. Itmanami is also stated, Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Yechanan, Va'amila, Amar Acha bar Chana, Amar Yechanan. Mezuzah she'asa shtayim v'shalosh v'achas kshera. A mezuzah that is written in poetic form is kshera v'avad shelo yasene kikubed. Just don't make it like a tent. Meaning don't write 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, where it starts thin and progressively gets wider and looks like a tent. And also don't make it like a shvantz. In the opposite, starts wide and gets progressively thinner. Don't do that either. Chever or mamish plowing through this Amud. Amr of Chizda says, of Chizda ala oretz b'shita achrona. Now, in the mezuzah, of course, we have the parashiyot of Shema followed by Vayayim Shema. I actually let me pull up. I'm going to pull up an image right here. This is an image of the mezuzah scroll. This is what's in a mezuzah. You have Shema at the top. You have Vayayim Shema after that. That is the mezuzah. If you notice, all the way at the bottom of the parchment, the last line has 2 words, ala aretz. That is intentional. It's not just where the sefer happens to have finished. That is intentional. The last line of the mezuzah has the 2 words, al ha-aretz. Givaldig. Now, so says, Amr of Chizda says of Chizda, al ha-aretz b'shita achroina. That the words al ha-aretz are on the bottom line, right? Because at the end, of course, of V'ayayim Shema is L'man Yirbu Yimechem V'imei B'nechem Alo Adam Asher Nishba Hashem Avasechem Laseis Lochem Laseis Lohem. Okay, I've only been saying that every day for like 30 years. Kimei Hashemayim Ala Aretz. So the last words are Ala Aretz. They are on the last line. Ikidam to those who say B'sof Shita, to those who say that it is left aligned, that it is at the end of the last line, not like we see over here. Vikida Amrei B'tchila Shita, to those who say it's at the beginning of the line, as we see in our example. Manda Amr B'sof Shita, according to the opinion who says it's at the end of the line, Ki Gvoa Shamayim Ala Aretz, Manda Amr B'tchila Shita Ki Eichi Dimrachka Shamayim V'aretz, that Ala Aretz is the last 2 words of L'man Yirbu Yimechem V'mei B'nechem, so that we have long life. So there's 2 perspectives on how to represent that with the words al aretz on the last line. One option is that it should be aligned at the end of the line, so that if you notice, if you look at the previous line, the last word is hashamayim, right? Kimei hashamayim. So the last word on the previous line is hashamayim. And then if you have ala aretz all the way at the end, so you have shamayim above aretz. You get you get it? So you have shamayim ala aretz, like the pasuk says, ki gvoya shamayim ala aretz. And we want to have long days, just like the distance between the heaven and the earth is long. We want the distance between our birth and our expiration to be long. The other opinion is that we want the physical distance between the word haaretz to be as far as possible from hashamayim. So therefore we have shamayim at the end of the previous line, and we have ala aretz at the beginning of the next line. And as we can see from our example here, we have ala aretz at the beginning of the last line. We now move on to the third section of today's daf. The spacing of a mezuzah between parashiyot. Now this is fascinating, in my opinion. This is a fascinating discussion. Maybe I will even begin this section with a little bit of a quick discussion. So in the Torah, and as we're going to discuss also in the context of mezuzahs, there is a concept of a psucha and a stuma. Can anybody tell me what a psucha and a stuma is? So here we have over here just a random photo of a random column from a sefer Torah, and we have two arrows. We have a white arrow and a blue arrow. The white arrow is pointing to a psucha. What a psucha is, so it's taka ashayla what a psucha is. It's taka ashayla what a psucha is. So we're just going to go with the standard definition of a psucha. This photo represents kind of a standard definition of a psucha, and without getting into details, psucha is what the white arrow is pointing to, which is you have some writing on a line, you leave the rest of the line empty, and you start writing once again on the next line. That is what's called a parshiyot psucha. And a stuma is, as you could see, there are three stumas on this column. The blue arrow is pointing to the middle one, it's pointing to one of them. A stuma is when, right, a parshiyot stuma is when you have writing at the beginning of the line, a space in the middle of the line, and some more writing at the end of the line. That's what's called a stuma. So a psucha is when the whole line is open, and a stuma is when there's a space in the middle of the line, but it's kind of contained. Okay, that is what a parshiyot psucha and a parshiyot stuma is. Now, Reb Chelbo says Reb Chelbo, Chazina le Rav Huna, I saw Rav Huna dikarich le me'echod klape shma. Okay, very interesting. So let's have another look at our mezuzah cloth, at our mezuzah writing. So at the top of the mezuzah, you see it says Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. So now, of course, we know in our mezuzahs this scroll is rolled up and usually put into a case. Not always. You can really just kind of tape the scroll to the door. That also works. I think I've seen it before. Now, Rav Huna would basically would start rolling on the left side, right, from Echad to Shema, which is interesting that it says from Echad to Shema, because if you look on our standard cloths, the first line does not end with Echad. It also says Ve'ahavta Ace. Anyways, Rav Huna would roll up the cloth from the left side, from Echad, and roll it until Shema, until the right side, and then he would hang it on his door. Okay. So again, Amr b'chabel chazina le Rav Huna, I saw Rav Huna the karich le me'echad klap Shema, that he rolled the cloth from Echad towards Shema. Ve'osa parashiyot stumos. Okay, here, now this is where things get controversial. Rav Huna would make his parshiyos stuma. So what does that mean? Well, we talked about parshiyos stumas. It means that between Shema and Vaya im Shamoya, there would be a parshiyos stuma that basically Bisharecha would end wherever it ends. And on the same, there would be a little gap. And then on the same line, he would start writing V'haya im Shamaya. Okay. Meisvei, but we have a contradiction. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Meir, who we know from Masechta, from Masechta Eruvin, we know that Reb Meir was a lavler. He was a scribe. He was a sofer. And Reb Meir ayakosva al duchsustus azoi. Reb Meir would write the mezuzah on duchsustus. I think I have a separate section for talking about the parchment of Sifrei kodesh. Yeah, so we'll talk about duchsustus a little bit later. Let's focus now. We have a few major discussions today. One of them being psuchas and stumas. So we'll kick that can down the road. The whole gvil klaf duchsustus discussion. I can't really say the whole discussion because I have to imagine that the discussion is way bigger than I have gotten into, but it's a very interesting discussion that we will get into today, at least if not just to whet our appetites, to do our own research on our own after this. Anyways, to focus on psuchas and stumas. So Reb Meir, so for now, let's just say that when it comes to animal hides for writing on, the ones that I'm aware of are gevil, which we'll talk about later what it is, klaf, which we're probably most familiar with because I think essentially all of our Sifrei Torah, mezuzahs, Tefillins, Megillas, Esther's, I think they're all written on klaf. So there's gvil, klaf, and duchsustus. We will get into them a little bit more later. I don't think that we need to get into it now yet. If we do, I'll talk about it now, but I don't think we need to. Okay. So Reb Meir aya kosva al duchsustus. Reb Meir would write mezuzahs on duchsustus instead of klaf. Kimin daf, and he would write it like a column. We had talked earlier about maybe having 2 words per line, maybe 2, 3, 1. Reb Meir would write it standard, kind of like we saw earlier. The mezuzah just looks like kind of a pretty standard column. Also revach milamal, revach milamata. He would have space. There would be margin above the column as well as below the column. Also parashiyot psuchis. And Reb Meir would make his parashiyos psuchis. So where Shema ended, uvisharecha, and Vayoim Shema started, it would be a new line. It would be a new line. So he would make his parashiyos psuchis. Amarti lo. So says Reb Shimon ben Elazar, I said to Reb Meir, Rebbe Matam, how come the parshas are psuchis? How come you're making parshas psuchis? Amali, and it says Reb Shimon ben Elazar that Reb Meir says to me, Hoyel ve'ein smuchis min Torah. Since in the Torah they are not next to each other. Shema is in parshas ve'eschonon, and Vayom Shema is in parshas Ekev. They are in completely different parshas in the Torah. Therefore, since they are not next to each other, so we are not going to. So therefore says Reb Meir that he puts them on separate lines. Even though where Uvisharecha ends in the actual Torah, the next parsha begins on the same line. It's a parsha stuma in the Torah. Happens to be the first word of the next one is also V'haya in the Torah. But because the fact of the matter is they're in different parashiyos, so therefore in the mezuzah we write them on separate lines. Rav Chananel Amar Rav says Chananel Amar Rav Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar. That Rav Chananel says the name of Rav that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, which sounds like what it means that it's that on the mezuzah it's going to be a psucha rather than a stuma, like Reb Shimon ben Elazar and Reb Meir say. My lava psuchis. Sounds like Rav is paskening that in the mezuzah you should have a parsha psucha. Lo arevach. No. When Rav is saying that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, it's with regard to the fact that we need space above and below the writing. Above and below the column. But in terms of between the parshas, stuma. V'chama revach, how large is this margin above and below the text? Amr Menashe bar Yaakov Amrilo Amr Shmuel bar Yaakov Kimlo Atba Disafre. The Sofrim, when they're writing, they use some kind of a clip some kind of a paper clip of sorts to keep the cloth attached to the table, to the writing surface that they're writing on, said it doesn't move while they're writing. So that was a standard size, the size of this clip. So enough space above and below the text for a clip to be able to hold it down. Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef, V'atlo tizbro d'chi Rav arevach. So now Abai says to Rav Yosef, you must agree with that explanation that when Rav says that the halacha is like Rishon ben Elazar, it's specifically with regard to the margins above and below, not with regard to there being a psucha between the two parshas of Shema, of the mezuzah, and that rather you must agree that Rav holds that in terms of the spacing, it would be a stuma rather than a psucha, not like Reb Meir has, because after all, the Rav islay minhaga. Rav, as a principle, says that we go based on minig, and if the minig is a certain way, that is what we are going to do. And nowadays, the minig is that in mezuzahs, it's a parsha stuma between Shema and Vayim Shamaya. It is not a parsha psucha, it's a parsha stuma. And therefore, since that is the minog, surely Rav would hold that way, because he as on principle, he goes based on whatever. If the minog is a certain way, that he will perpetuate that minog. Omar Rabba Omar Rav Kana Omar Rav, that as an example of where we see that Rav says that we go based on what the minog is, that that if a minog is a certain way, we will follow that. As we see that Rabbah says the name of Kana in the name of Rav, Im Yaveh Eliyahu, if Elijah the prophet comes, V'yomar, and he'll say, Cholzin b'minol, that we do chalitza with a shoe, Shomin lo, okay, so we will start doing chalitza with a shoe. Ein cholzin b'sandal, if he says that we don't do chalitza with a sandal, ein shomin lo, we won't listen to him, shekvar nagu a'am b'sandal, because the minig is already that we use a sandal for chalitza. And therefore, if Elijah the prophet is going to say not to do it, we're not going to listen to him, because the minig is to use a sandal, and that's relevant. That's important. And we're going to keep on doing it like the minig is. Rav Yosef Amar Rav Kana Amar Rav. Rav Yosef says the name of Rav Kana, the name of Rav slightly differently. Im Yavar Eliyahu v'Yomar ein cholzin b'middle. If Elijah the prophet comes and says we don't do chalitza with a shoe, shomin lo, fine, we'll listen to him, no problem. Ein cholzin b'sandal ein shomin lo. But again, like Rav had said, if Elijah the prophet comes and says we don't do chalitza with a sandal, we will not listen to him. Shekvar nagu ha'am b'sandal, because the minig is already to use a sandal, and therefore we are going to do that. And we say, my benayu, what's the difference between Rabbah and Rav Yosef? Minol lechatchile ki benayu. The difference between them is minol lechatchile, using a shoe lechatchile. Right? Rabbah had said, if Elijah the prophet comes and says to you that we can use a shoe, fine, then I'll say we can use a shoe, implying that right now we wouldn't use a shoe. Rav Yosef says, if Elijah the prophet comes and says, don't use a shoe, we'll listen to him. So then that implies that now we do use shoes, although it sounds like the minig is certainly everyone seems to agree that the minig is accepted to use a sandal. So we see that in both, right, in the statement of Rabbah and the statement of Rav Yosef, both attributed to Rav, significance is given to what the minig is, and therefore, Elav Shmamina, Arevach Shmamina. Therefore, rather, it must be that since the minig is that in mezuzahs, the parsha is stuma, the minig is to write a parsha stuma in a mezuzah, so therefore, it must be that Rav respected that minig, and when he was saying that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, it must not have been in regard to the mezuzah being a parsha psucha, rather it must have been in regard to the other statements that he made, which is that we have a margin above and below the text. That is what Rav was saying the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar in that regard. Interestingly, the Tosfos points out that the Yerushalmi in Masechta Megillah, in Perek, I think it was Perek Gimel halacha tes, Perek Aleph halacha tes. I could look it up, but whatever. The Yerushalmi Megillah, however, says that quotes Rav as explicitly saying that we have parashiyot psucha in the mezuzah, which the whole thing with that Yerushalmi is talking interesting, but anyway, just pointing that out. Now, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok says, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok, mitzvah la'asoson stumis. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok comes to resolve the difference and says, look, the mitzvah, ideally we would make it stumis, respect the minig. V'yavdinu psuchis, if you make it psuchis, so then shapir dami, that is also fine. Umay psuchis the kamar Reb Shimon ben Elazar. And what does it mean when Reb Shimon ben Elazar says psuchis af psuchis? It means you can even make it psuchis. That's what Reb Shimon ben Elazar is saying. That it should be stumis, and that's like what our minhag is, but it can even be psuchis as well. Let's say that the following supports Rav Nachman bar Yitzchok, that it should be stumis, but it can be psuchis. Kayotzi bo sefer Torah shebalo v'tefillin shebalo. If you have a sefer Torah that is worn out and it's not going to be used as a sefer Torah anymore, or if you have tefillin that got worn out and it's not going to be used as the cloth isn't going to be used for tefillin anymore, ein osim mein mezuzah. We don't make them into a mezuzah. We don't make a sefer Torah or tefillin into a mezuzah. How come? Not for any technical reasons, simply because Sefer Torah and Tefillin are considered a higher level of kedusha than mezuzah is. Rashi says because Tefillin has 4 parshiyos in it, mezuzah only has 2 parshiyos. Sefer Torah, mezuzah and Tefillin are considered to be on a higher level than mezuzah is, and therefore, if a sefer Torah mezuzah gets worn out, if a sefer Torah tefillin gets worn out, and you have an idea, maybe we could salvage Shemaim Vayim Shema for a mezuzah. We can't do that. Why? Not for any reason other than the fact that they are on higher levels of kedusha, and we're not now going to use them for a lower level of kedusha. Hamoridin osin, implying that if not for that reason of the differences in kedusha levels, there wouldn't be any other objection. But how come we would be able to use sefer parshas from the sefer Torah for mezuzah? Hochas stumis in the sefer Torah, as we had said earlier, after the parasha of Shema, the next parasha begins on the same line. It's stumis v'ocha psuchis, and here on the tefillin, it is psuchis. Rather, from the fact that there are no other issues, the only issue is the levels of kedusha, it must mean that in the tefillin as well, it is stuma. It's a parsha stuma, and that is why we can say, okay, if not for the fact that Sefer Torah is on a higher level than mezuzah, we'd be able to use the parshas for mezuzah because they are both stumas. Duma lahashlim. To which the Gemara says, no, maybe that's not an indication. It could still be that in the Tefillin it is a parsha psucha. And what does it mean that we'd be able to use, if not for the fact that Sefer Torah is on a higher level than mezuzah, we would be able to use the parshiyos for a mezuzah? It means if we need to fill in a line, right? So if there's a line in a mezuzah that is problematic, so we can, and the Sefer Torah is worn out and can't be used, so maybe we can just take one line from the Sefer Torah and put it into the mezuzah and kind of stitch it into the mezuzah and use that, but it may not have any implication for psuchas versus tumas. Okay, fine. So we want to try to bring a proof from there, but it's not definitive. So friends, now I want to show you something fascinating. The fascinating thing that I want to show you is, if we look again at our mezuzah, we just had a whole discussion about between the parsha of Shema and Vayim Shema. Is it a parsha psucha, which would mean that it starts at the beginning of the next line, or is it a parsha stuma, which means that that there's a space it ends in one line and a little space and continues on the same line? If you look at our mezuzahs, this writing is how it is a standard mezuzah writing. And if you notice where the blue arrow is, where Parshas Vayim Shema begins, there is an indentation. There's a space at the beginning of the line. What is that? what is that? What in the world is that? Tosfos is trying to figure out what this is. The truth is, it's a huge question. It's a huge. Tosfos is like scrambling to figure out that So we just spent all this time saying that the minig is to be for stumis. Should it be stumer? Should it be psuchas? In the end, Lemaisa, this is what we have. An indentation at the beginning of the line. Tosfos is scrambling to figure out what is this indentation. The fact of the matter is, it's not clear. Also, he quotes a version of the Yerushalmi that gets involved. His version of the Yerushalmi is at least different than the version of the Yerushalmi that I saw. It's a huge question. We're not going to get into it or do it any justice, whatever, but I thought that it would be important that if we're learning this sugya, we should at least have a look at what the klaf actually looks like compared to the actual discussion of the Gemara, which is about is it psucha or stuma. It looks like what we have here is kind of nothing. So I'll tell you, I'll give you a few little tidbits. I'm not just saying it's a huge question and go away, but just to get a little bit of a feel for what we're talking about over here. So first of all, Rashi doesn't seem to say anything in the standard text of Rashi, but there is a Rashi quoted somewhere where he says that, so when defining a stuma, he says, like we define the stuma, inami or else maniach cholak broshatev ashita. So Rashi gives an alternative definition to stuma for what we had said, which is a space in the middle of the line. Rashi gives an alternate explanation for what parashiyot stuma, which is you can even have a space at the beginning of the line, which would mean that what we're looking at would technically be considered a stuma, which would also be in line with the minim. Okay, that makes sense. Tosfos quotes Rashi actually as saying that possibly this could be considered stuma, not definitively. What does Rashi say? V'shema gamze kori stuma. Tosfos quotes Rashi as saying maybe this could be also considered stuma. So just even in terms of what does Rashi say, in one place he's saying it is a stuma, the other place he's saying maybe it's a stuma. There's other shitas. For example, he quoted Tosfos quotes the Masechta Sofrim, who says that a space at the beginning of the line is actually considered a psucha, and apparently the Rush maybe says that as well. It's considered a psucha. There's different girsos of what the Yerushalmi says. The gears of the Yerushalmi quoted by Tosfos is that this would be considered a psucha, but the gears of the Yerushalmi that I saw, I think, said that it would be considered a stuma. Anyways, it's a whole big question of like what this peculiar thing that we do is over here, that we have this space at the beginning. I just want to kind of make us aware of the fact that in our mezuzahs that we have on all of our doorposts, it's very, it's how it's written, and the next time we see it, we'll actually realize like, wow, okay, that, right, we learned about this in Masechet Menachos, and this is actually a whole interesting discussion here about like, this is peculiar. I don't know that anywhere in a sefer Torah we have an indentation like this. So anyways, just wanted to put that on our radars. Friends, now we're going to discuss a little bit about the parchment of Sifrei Kodesh. So let's actually talk about this. This is also a super interesting discussion as well. So in terms of what are Sifrei Kodesh written on, when I say Sifrei Kodesh, I'm talking about I'm just going to talk about, let's say, sefer Torah, Tefillin, mezuzah. Let's not worry about like Megillah Esther right now because it's not coming up here. Honestly, sefer Torah isn't so much coming up here either. So let's actually even start. Let's start by talking about what this parchment is. So I didn't make any slides or anything or go into this in depth in any way. There's a lot of like very kind of like survey, definitely surface level things there. We're not going into depth over here, but kind of getting a survey of like what's out there on all of these topics. Anyways, so when it comes to the parchment of Sifrei Kodesh, so basically the hide of an animal, when the hair has been removed from it and it's been like kind of just, I guess the first level of tanning, the hide is just tanned, remove the hair, tan the hide. That is what's called gvil. That kind of just processing of the hide like that is called the gvil. Now, the gvil can be separated into two, almost like I'm imagining, let's say, just kind of, peeling back the outer layer of the gvil, and now you'll have kind of two sections that you're left with. Interestingly, so Tosfos in Masechta Shabbos on Daf Ayin Tes, so he says that the outer layer is what's called the klaf. It's like a klipa, it's like an outer shell. The outer thinner layer is what's called the klaf, and the inner thicker layer that's closer to the actual meat of the animal is what's called the duchsustus. And as we're going to see, a tefillin should be written on klaf, and mezuzah should be written on duchsustus. Interestingly, I saw that the Rambam says punkt verkehrt, the exact opposite. That the outer layer is the duchsustus, and that the inner layer, the inner thicker layer, is the klaf. And there's major nafkaminas because, for example, tefillin needs to be written on klaf. It can't be written on duchsustus. And it seems like what Tosfos consider klaf to be klaf is what the Rambam calls duchsustus. What the Rambam considers to be klaf is what Tosfos calls duchsustus. So it's unbelievable that the mamish say the opposite. So that is super interesting. Another thing to point out, I messaged my friend Josh Weinberg yesterday. I said, do you know if they still write mezuzahs on duchsustus? Because as we're going to see in the Gemara, mezuzahs should be written on duchsustus. So apparently we lost the tradition for how to separate, for how to properly separate and distinguish between klaf and duchsustus. So we just do everything on what we consider klaf. So our Sifrei Torah, we didn't get to Sifrei Torah yet, but okay, our Sifrei Torah, our Tefillin, our Mezuzahs, we write on klaf. But interestingly, apparently the Teimanim still have the tradition for how to separate the klaf and the duchsustus, and I guess that they write their Mezuzahs on duchsustus, I guess. That's the way it should be. So I'm curious to see what that actually looks like. What does a Teimani Mezuzah look like? In terms of Sifrei Torah, we don't say anything about Sifrei Torah over here, but what do we do about Sifrei Torah? In Masechta Shabbos and Daf Ayin Tesamud Beis, there is a brisa that says that Sifrei Torah can be written on Gevil, Klaf, or Duchsustus. The Rambam seems to say not Duchsustus though. Lemaisa, I think that we write all of our Sifrei Kodesh on Klaf, but very, very interesting to know about these different. We write everything on klaf. It's interesting to know the context that is swirling around all of these decisions and practices. Okay, so says the Gemara on the second wide line of Daf Lamed Beis Amid Aleph, Hamoridin Osin. Getting back to that initial question, we're going to ask this question I think one or two more times. That again, we had said that sefer Torah and Tefillin cannot be made into mezuzah because they're on higher levels of kedusha, and tefillin is on a lower level of kedusha, implying that if not for that reason, there would be no other impediments. But what about Ve'atani? We learn in the Brayso, Halach Moshe Misinai, tefillin ala klaf, tefillin is written on klaf, and mezuzah al duchsustus, and that mezuzah is written on duchsustus. Klaf b'makom seyar, klaf b'makom basar, duchsustus b'makom seyar. And when you write on klaf, you write on the inner side of the klaf, okay? So remember, we said that klaf was separated from the duchsustus, which would mean, okay, so there's the klaf, there's the layer of the klaf that is out, where like the hairs were on, and then there's the lower, inner level of the klaf. So we write on the inner level of the klaf. When it comes to duchsustus, it's the opposite. You write on the outer level of the klaf. Okay. Fine. So what did we just see? We saw that tefillin needs to be written on klaf. Mezuzahs are written on duchsustus. So I don't understand how tefillin, which is written on klaf, we even have the havmina to say that it should be able to be usable. If not for the fact that it's a different level of kedusha, it should be able to be used as a mezuzah. I thought mezuzahs need to be written on duchsustus. So lemitzvah, ideally, lechatchila, mezuzah should be written on duchsustus, which is interesting. The chatchila, mezuzah should be written on duchsustus, but we lost that tradition apparently, and therefore we just write it on klaf. Anyways, but thankfully we say that it can be written on klaf, which is what we do. But don't we learn in the Brayso Shina Pasul that if you make any changes, it's possible. But tefillin, it's possible by tefillin. Tefillin cannot be written on duchsustus, which is unbelievable, right? Because we saw that there's a major machlokas. I have to imagine the machlokas is bigger than just Tosfos and the Rambam. But mamish, the Rambam and Tosfos have opposite opinions on what klaf and duchsustus is. Unbelievable. So I guess what the Rambam would say, you're writing tefillin on, Tosfos would say it's possible. What Tosfos would say you're writing on tefillin, the Rambam would say it's possible. Unbelievable. Again, there might be I'm sure that there's a much bigger discussion here, but wow. So by tefillin, if you write tefillin d'chsustus, no good. We learn in the Brisa Shina ben baza vein baza pasul. But we learn in the Brisa that if you make a change in either one, it's pasul. Which sounds like it means if you write tefillin on d'chsustus, or if you write mezuzah on klaf, either way, bein baza uvein baza pasul. No. They're both talking about tefillin, but two different types of psulim by tefillin, which are one issue, one psul by tefillin is if sure you write it on klaf, but on the outer side. We had said that klaf needs to be written on the inner side. Or even if you write it on the inner side, even if you write it on the inner side, but you write it on duchsustus on the inner side, whereas duchsustus needs to be written on the outer side. Alternatively, shina bazu vaze tanoi, or you could say it's taka machlekes tanoim. So we had said shina bazu vaze is pasul. Whether tefillin is written on duchsustus, whether mezuzah is written on klaf, it's pasul. We had just said that no, it's talking about tefillin, but you could say no, it's saying that it's pasul. But we have a brisa where we see that it's taka machlekes. Tanoi decided that we learned in the brisa shina bazu vaze pasul, like we had just said that if mezuzah is written on a klaf or tefillin on duchsustus, pasul. Reb Acha machshir mishum Reb Acha Reb Chanina v'amilo mishum Reb Yaakov Reb Chanina. Okay, fine. So we see it's taka machlokes about if specifically where the nafkamina is if you wrote mezuzah on klaf, would it be kosher or pasul? We see that it is taka a machlokes. And now we get up to the topic of etching lines into Sifrei kodesh. That's what's called sirtut, right? If you look at a sefer Torah or at a Megillah or mezuzah, there are lines etched into it, and the scribe, I imagine the point is that the scribe follows those lines as he is writing to make it beautiful. Hamoridin Osin, again, back to this question of, we're saying that the only issue is the levels of kedusha, that sefer Torah and tefillin are on a higher level of kedusha of than mezuzah. What about the fact that there's a fundamental difference, which is va'abaya sirtut? Tefillin don't have sirtut, and mezuzahs do have sirtut. How could you use the writing of tefillin, which has no sirtut, for a Megillah, for a mezuzah, which requires sirtut? The Amar of Manyomi bar Chilkio, Amar of Chama bar Guria, Amar of Kol mezuzah she'ena misurtetes psula. That if a mezuzah does not have sirtut, it's possible. From Minyamin bar Chilkio Didei Omar, and Rabbi Minyamin bar Chilkio himself says, Sirtut shel mezuzah alach l'Moshe misinai. The taka, the sirtut of the etching of the lines into a mezuzah is taka alach l'Moshe misinai. No, so how can we be saying that in principle you can use tefillin writing for a mezuzah if tefillin does not require sirtut and mezuzah does? Again, Tanoi, we say with this topic as well, it's machlokas Tanoim, Desani, that we learn in the Brisa. Rabbi Yirmiyah Omer says Rabbi Yirmiyah Mishum Rabbeinu. Okay, I don't know who the Tana Rabbi Yirmiyah is, and I don't know who Rabbeinu is. Rabbeinu is maybe Rabbeinu HaKadosh, maybe Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Tefillin and mezuzahs nichtavos shelo min aksav. Tefillin and mezuzahs can be written without looking at a source text, right? You would imagine if you're writing a sefer Torah, for example, you're going to want to be looking at the text that you write it correctly. But tefillin and mezuzahs, Shema, V'hayim Shamoah, Kadesh V'hayim are so prevalent that you don't need to look at a source text. You could just write it by heart. I mean, I imagine that there still are probably words that are written with a yud, without it. I imagine you probably still want it. But anyways, okay, you don't need, I guess if you know all the details, it's not so crazy to know all the details of these parshiyos, and you can write them without writing from a source text. Ve'ein, kilo as a reference. Ve'ein tzrichos sirtut, and tefillin and mezuzahs don't require sirtut. So if that being the case, I can understand why there's a havmina to say that you can use the text of tefillin in a mezuzah. The hilchasa, and friends, if you want to know the halacha, tefillin lo ba'i sirtut, that tefillin do not require sirtut, mezuzah ba'ya sirtut, and mezuzahs do require sirtut. V'idi nichtavos shelo min aksav, and both of them can be written without a source reference text. You can just do it off the top. You can write it based on your memory. My taima migaris grisen, because these texts are so widespread, are so well known. Shema, Vayim Shema, even Kadesh, Vayiki V'acha. They are so wide known that you can just do it from memory. There's no requirement for a source text to reference. Chevre, what about Sifrei Torah? Do Sifrei Torah require sirtut? That is a very interesting question. Tosfos discusses this. He quotes a Gemara in Masechta Megillah on Daf Tes Zayin, where the Gemara says that the pasuk says in the Megillah, in Megillah's Esther, Divrei Shalom ve'emes, about which the Gemara Megillah says that the Megillah requires sirtut, that you must etch lines into the Megillah. Why? Ka'amito shel Torah, like the truth of the Torah. And Rashi says there that what's Amita shel Torah? So Rashi says in Masechta Megillah, like the sefer Torah, that there's halacha l'Moshe misinai, that sirtut is halacha l'Moshe misinai. My impression is that what Rashi is saying, that the sirtut of a sefer Torah is halacha l'Moshe misinai. So based on that, Rashi's opinion would be that sirtut is a requirement for a sefer Torah. Tosfos, however, says that there is, what does Tosfos say? He says, are you regiling the side of sefer Torah? So Tosfos says that maybe they actually didn't necessarily you do sirtut in a sefer Torah, and Tosfos suggests that what Amita shel Torah might actually be a reference to the mezuzah, because the mezuzah has Shema and Vayim Shamoah, which is Kabbalah Somach Shamayim. And Tosfos says that, quotes Rabbeinu Tam, who says that still we should do sirtut for a sefer Torah because of Zekeli ve'anveyu, that to do mitzvahs beautifully, and if you have sirtut, you have the lines on the sefer Torah, so then you can write a beautiful sefer Torah. You have the lines to guide you, and you can keep everything beautiful. So even if there's no requirement for sirtut, like Rashi had said, Rabbeinu Tam says, Rashi's grandson, Rabbeinu Tam says that nonetheless, we should still do sirtut in the sefer Torah because of Zekeli v'anveyu. So very interesting there also. So in terms of sefer Torah, so we had said that by Tefillin, there's no need for, the halacha is that there's no need for sirtut. By mezuzahs, we say the halacha is that we do sirtut. We don't say what to do about sefer Torah. Tosfos, we've seen Tosfos that there's different opinions about whether there's a requirement for sirtut for sefer Torah or no requirement, but still you should do it because Zekeli v'anveyu. Very interesting there, discussion there as well. And finally, the topic of sitting on the same couch as a sefer Torah. Amar Reb Chelbo, says Reb Chelbo, on a chazisa Rav Huna, I saw Rav Huna. Interesting, because we quoted Reb Chelbo earlier also. Interesting. We at the bottom of Lamed Aleph Mebez. I didn't realize it until now. We said Amar Reb Chelbo chazina le Rav Huna, and now again we see Amar Reb Chelbo on a chazisa le Rav Huna. I saw Rav Huna dava Yosef Apuria de Sefer Torah Olel, that he was sitting, or at least wanted to sit. What's that? He probably meant it to wants to sit. Yeah, that he wanted to sit on a couch or a bed. I assume that the bed means a form of couch. That there was a sefer Torah on it. That there was a sefer Torah on this bed. So what did he do? So he took a jug and flipped it over on the ground to make some kind of surface, like a table-like surface. Ve'anach ole sefer Torah, and he put the sefer Torah on the jug so that he could then sit on the bed. V'hadu Yosef mita, and only then did he proceed to sit on the bed. Kasaver, because if Huna holds also leishev al gabe mita she sefer Torah munach aleh, that it is forbidden to sit on a bed that a sefer Torah is lying on. So therefore, he put the sefer Torah on a different surface and then sat on the bed. Ufligad Rab Babachana Rabbi Yechanan mutter leishev al gabimita shesefer Torah munach aleh. That Rabbi Yochanan says you are actually allowed to sit on a bed that a sefer Torah is on. Very interesting. I wouldn't have thought that. And if someone's going to say to you, what about Ma'aseh Rabbi Elazar? There was a Ma'aseh Rabbi Elazar Yoshev al mita, who was sitting on a bed. Sefer Torah munach aleh. He remembered, oh no, he realized that there's a sefer Torah on this bed. V'nishmat, and he went v'yoshev al gabi karki, sat on the floor. So clearly, it sounds like you shouldn't be sitting on a bed that has a sefer Torah on it. And then he looked from the look on his face as if he was bitten by a snake. He was so shooken up by what had happened. Hasam Sefer Torah gabe karkav. No. The reason why he was all shooken up is because the Sefer Torah was not on the bed. Sefer Torah was on the floor. That is why Rabbi Elazar got so shooken up. But Rabbi Yochanan says that you can sit on a bed that has a Sefer Torah on it. Wow. Chaver, what an unbelievable daf. Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Menachos. So many interesting details and discussions, and we just kind of whet our appetites for so many. We just kind of scratch the surface of so many of these fascinating topics. Chevet, to review what we learned today. Fixing up tears in a sefer Torah. We said up to 2 columns when treated with walnut juice. So when treated with walnut juice in the sefer Torah is a darker shade and the tear is more pronounced. So a tear that goes up to 2 columns into the parchment can be fixed you can even fix if it goes deeper than that when not treated with walnut juice and the tear is less pronounced. Now, when we're talking about fixing the tear and sewing it together, we're talking about fixing it with sinew threads, not like thready threads. We discussed the column of a mezuzah. Rav had said that it can be written with 2 words per line. We had said that it can be written like poetically, 2 words on one line, 3 on the next, 1 on the line after that. However, not like a tent or a tail, not getting progressively less or progressively more. Reb Meir, however, said that it should be written in 1 full column. Reb Meir, who of course was himself a sofer, says that the mezuzah should be written in 1 full column. As we saw the text of mezuzah, it looks like a pretty standard full column. We talked about the spacing of a mezuzah between parshas. That was a major discussion, very interesting. Rav Huna had said that between the parshas is a stuma. Reb Meir, however, said it is a psucha between the parshas. Rav's shita was completely confusing when you consider, first of all, he says that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, who was basically quoted in the brisa with Reb Meir, which would sound like Rav was saying that in mezuzahs it is a parsha psucha. So even though he says that essentially the halacha is like Reb Meir, I'm sorry, right, exactly. Well, I don't know what I just said. Rav has said that the halacha is essentially like Reb Meir, who says it's a parsha psucha. However, we had essentially questioned Rav because Rav generally holds like minhagim, and the minhag we have is to do a parsha stuma. So we had concluded that okay, Rav didn't actually say it should be a parsha psucha. He was just saying like some of the other things that the Reb Shimon Elazar had said with Reb Meir, which is, for example, the margins above and below. However, the Yerushalmi quotes Rav as being explicitly saying that it should be a parsha psucha. So Rav's shita is a bit vague. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak suggested that lichatchila it should be stuma, but you can also do it psucha. And what Reb Shimon ben Elazar was saying is that you can even do it psucha. We had then pointed out that lemaisa we tend to do something that's completely phenomenal, anomaly-ish, which is that we have this indentation before Vayayim Shama begins, which is like, what even is that? We saw that Rashi says that it either is a stuma or might be a stuma. One version of the Yerushalmi considers it a stuma. One version of the Yerushalmi considers it a psucha. We had seen from the Masechta Sofrim that it's a psucha. I think I saw maybe the Rosh is a psucha. Bichlal, what's going on with what we do? Super interesting question there. We discussed the parchment of Sifrei Torah. We said that Tefillin must be written on a cloth. Mezuzah lichatchila should be written on duchsustus, but we saw it's taka machlokes if it can be used a cloth. Sefer Torah, we saw based on the Gemara in Shabbos, it could be either cloth, maybe right, gvil, possibly duchsustus. L'maisa we write and everything on cloth. We said what exactly is cloth versus duchsustus versus gvil. So gvil is basically the hide when it's just tanned, you just remove the hair and tan it. if it is then divided, if then you pull out the outer layer is what's called, it's a big machlekes between the Rambam and Tosfos. Tosfos says the outer layer is klaf, the inner layer is duchsustus. The Rambam says fakert, the outer layer is duchsustus, the inner layer is klaf. So very, very interesting and big nafkaminas, because, for example, if we say tefillin has to be written on klaf, what is klaf? Unbelievable. Etching the lines in Sifrei kodesh. So by tefillin, we say that you don't need to have sirtut, which is etching the lines into the klaf. By mezuzah, we say it does require sirtut. What about sefer Torah? So Rashi Megillah says that sefer Torah requires sirtut. Tosfos wasn't so sure about that, and Tosfos says that, Tosfos quotes the sheet of Rabbeinu Tam, that even if sirtut is not a requirement, it is still preferred because of zekeli mavehu, to do mitzvahs beautifully. And finally, we saw a discussion about sitting on the same couch as a sefer Torah. Rav Huda says you can't. Rabbi Yochanan says you can. That was Daf Lamed Beis of Masechta Menachos. What a daf! I hope you have an amazing day. Cheers.